Welcome back. We are now at Fallen Empires Part 2. So Fallen Empires is a collection of garments inspired by the ultimately ephemeral nature of power. So this is a reminder that all leadership, all monarchies, all forms of power meet their eventual demise. So I covered the concept behind the collection and the first 5 garments of the collection in the last video, but the next 5 pieces of the collection start to really highlight something that I find that's really important in my own process, which is creating within the limitations of reused materials. So working within the confines of an existing shape of fabric, an existing quantity of fabric or yarn, or an existing falling apart piece of antique embroidery. So allowing the limitations to guide the creative process. And as I'm moving into starting my next collection, I'm reminded of just how frequently this dictates the final shapes of the garments that I create. So I love the way that the reuse of old materials it feels like it releases us from the need to know everything before we get started. Ironically enough, it feels like when we eliminate the infinite possibility of a new giant piece of fabric and we are forced to work instead within the constraints of our materials, it's like this openness to new ideas outside of our own minds starts to give us a little bit of space to notice new forms, new possibilities, new combinations. And as I mulled this over, this idea of using these limitations as basically a design prompt, I remembered some old words that I wrote about in a blog post about this idea of working with our limitations, because I feel like it's just a great reminder and it gives us a new starting point, sort of like a new vantage point to start to think from. And while it's certainly nice to have access to a range of materials in order to manifest our creative visions most accurately, I've also found some of my favorite works came directly from having to work with the confines of a certain situation, often known as a problem. Whether that, quote, problem is a stain caused by not properly stirring my fabric while I'm dyeing, or maybe it's a tear I'm trying to cover up with embroidery, or it's a scrap of fabric that is just so beautiful, but just not large enough to make what I want with it. Much of my work begins with an issue I'm required to work around. So what I've learned is that these limitations do not, as we might fear, bind us to their qualities. In fact, I feel they are liberating us from facing infinite potential, and they are helping to guide us to their future form. A streak in the dyeing process may demand that some paint be brought into the picture, employed in a very specific way following the lines of the streak. A tear in a fabric might dictate the necessity for thick and bold stitching, but a small hole or two may be easily mended with a delicate applique of vines, for example, strategically designed to cover them. So the images I just shared, those examples are all from past work. They're not from this collection, just an example of how to use that. But with that in mind, now let's go ahead and take a look at the rest of the collection. So some of the garments in this collection were truly shaped, like entirely shaped by the limitations of existing materials. And other garments, I found myself with all the fabric I could want, but instead of running into limitations in materials, I ran into the limitations of geometry. So the specific patchwork patterns that had to find themselves being wrapped in the round, so around the body. These limitations so frequently became the opportunity to rethink what I'd previously set my mind to, and honestly, I most often love the results even more than I initially thought I would. So let's start with the Dynasty dress. This one is just, oh my God, this one's just full of limitations. So that half yard of blue stripe fabric, plus the very specific shape of this disintegrating embroidery, and my desire for the garment to feel like this collage of colors and textures, while still feeling lightweight in that like, don't touch me sort of way that we all love in a summer dress. It just like floats away from the body. This dress took me a ridiculously long time to make, like days. At one point, I even sewed the embroidery part onto the dress upside down. So there was like an entire half a day of trying to figure out why it fit funny all of a sudden, trying to fix the fit, and then realizing that I had sewed it upside down. So having to pick out all the seams and resetting this top to the skirt right side up. So it started with this scrap of embroidery that I found in a giveaway pile. And I talked a little bit about this already in my spring journal video a few months back. I think this is a Chinese embroidery. It's silk. And that's where the name Dynasty dress came from. And the fabric on this is super delicate and it's falling apart, but I stitched the embroidery to a square of linen around all the edges of every single stitched area so that it will hopefully not fall apart anymore. And then I don't do much draping on my dress form. I mostly just use my dress form to figure out necklines and to fit clothes that I've already sewn. I love draping on a dress form, but I don't know, I just always end up with these fussy patterns for clothes that I feel like only fit one shape of person. So I prefer to do my little rectangle clothing thing, the methods I teach in my software course, and use the dress form basically as a way to see the backside of the garment. But this embroidery though, it felt like it needed to be stretched across the body. So I made this pretty fitted in the front and at the sides, but with 2 elastic tunnels at the back, which makes this size much more adjustable. There's pockets at the sides of the front panel. And I took a poll on Instagram and we all collectively decided that adding a little extra fullness to the sides was kind of necessary. It didn't quite have enough width to it. My favorite part about creating this piece, besides obviously rescuing the incredible vintage embroidery by using a free motion foot, and oh, by the way, thank you to the person who commented and let me know that I accidentally called it a walking foot in my spring journal video. This is a free motion foot. But yeah, my other favorite part about the process of making this is this blue stripe. This is another Ruby Star Society fabric that I only bought like a half a yard of, and then they were sold out. But this stripe continued to show me a new and better way of working with it. So first, I had just wanted to use a stripe solid, like just straight up and down, but because I overlapped it in a weird way on the dress form, and I saw how cool it looked with the stripe shifted, I was like, okay, I know I have to take advantage of shifting the panel one stripe to create that sort of checkerboard look that you can now see on the front panel. And then I wanted to do checkerboard straps too. So this is hilarious. At first I imagined cutting out all of these 2-inch wide strips up and down the length of the strap, sewing them together and basically taking like 2 hours to assemble the straps. But then one night I walked into my studio and I looked at the way it was folded and I realized, oh, duh, you can just do a single seam all the way up and down the strap, get the exact same checkerboard design, and it's one seam, or I think it was 2 seams. So I love it when you realize that sort of thing before you start sewing. Next up, we have a bit of crochet. We have the Theodora Tea, which is basically a rectangle tee, but in crochet. And now is my time to remind you, if you still haven't taken the free rectangle tee mini course, what have you been doing? Anyways, so the Theodora Tea, I started on my 40th birthday. I celebrated by myself at the spa. It was super sunny and the snow covered the ground outside. I was rocking that midweek discount. No one else was there. And I, of course, as one does, brought a bag of yarn with me. So I chose a color palette that I liked from the yarns where I had a pile that was like, it's not quite enough to make a top, definitely not enough to make a top on their own, but I imagined I could make a top with all of these different colors combined. I imagined being the operative word there. I'd maybe do a bit more actual math and less imagining last time, but I got lucky and it all worked out, like just barely. So I started this top at the back. I started on one side, so I crocheted it from side to side. I like starting on the back because I can kind of sort out any color issues or changes in stitches, anything in an area that isn't front and center, so like making all my problems on the back. So I did a row of chain and then a single row of stitches on that to sort of get an idea of what the final length would be. And then I put that up to my body. So when I decided I liked that length, I then went ahead and stitched the entire rectangle of the back from left to right while I problem solved what I was going to do for the front. So, oh my God, I forgot to even mention the inspiration for this one. So this one was inspired by the Byzantine Empress Theodora, who was married to the Emperor Justinian. So she was said to have a pretty prominent role in leadership at the time, and like her own story, like her pre-Empress history, maybe they were just trying to like, you know, trash talk or whatever, but it made even me blush. But perhaps more importantly to her impact on society, she really seemed like she was like really an advocate for women's rights and also for supporting women at many different stages and many different life situations. So that was really cool to read about. But this top was inspired by the mosaics of the Byzantine era. And these mosaics are just so stunning. So I tried to translate the sort of isolated forms of a mosaic through the very much continuous technique of crochet. This is a really fun way to stretch my like invent your own stitches muscles. And I started at the inside of the design, so at the top of the center front, and I worked my way out in a giant rectangle, 3 sides of the rectangle stitching on it until I got the design to the same length as the back. And then I stitched up and down each side until I got to the same width as the back. And then I used a few rows of crochet at the underarm and at the shoulder to give the garment a little bit of shape. So rectangles with a little bit of extra shaping. And I'm actually, for my next Make It With Me lesson in my Softwork Intuitive Garment Design course, it'll be about designing your own crochet tops. So I'm working on that now, and the full process of this Theodora top will be included in that Make It With Me lesson. But basically, love how this turned out. Probably gonna keep it. And then there is the Ziggurat dress, which the inspiration is pretty clear. The classic ancient ziggurat. So I was just playing around with an old idea of mine and trying to update it. So last year I made this giant dress, you may have seen it, out of some gorgeous cotton gauze. And I joke that it's like hot air balloon chic. But the truth is, it just felt a little bit too overpowering, though it makes a really great, strong statement piece. I just was like, this is a lot of fabric. I recorded the making of this dress for one of my Make It With Me episodes in my software course, and whether or not you think the style is overpowering, it was a really great lesson in designing with patchwork and, of course, rectangles. So I wanted to revisit this design at a scale that was a little bit more approachable. I wanted to make some subtle adjustments, like adding some shaping to the front and back neck. And even though it makes it a little less zero waste, it makes it a little more wearable. And if you don't wear it, oh honey, that is 100% waste. And then, so yeah, that was the Ziggurat dress. I think that's spot on that. And then we have the Constantinople Pant, which was just like a mathematical configuration conundrum. The pants themselves, super simple. These are the pants that I teach in my software course, and I also did a Make It With Me lesson on that. I didn't mean for this all to be about my Make It With Me lesson. It just happens to be that I have a lot of them now, and I like these shapes. But I shared how I made the muslin, so that's the mock-up for this pant, the first like initial mock-up for the pant. I shared the preview of that on one of my YouTubes as well. I think it's called like the wide leg pant skirt because it looks like a skirt. But these were inspired by the Theodosian walls of Constantinople, which has these cool little notches or whatever they're called. And I actually love that I drew the pant and I named it the Constantinople Pant before I even looked up the wall, before I had even heard of the wall. And then when I was trying to figure out how to tie in the Constantinople, I was like, I just named it that like on a whim. An image of the wall popped up and I was like, there we go. Perfect. Done. I don't need to do anything else. I ended up having my challenge coming up later in the pant. So the hard part about this was trying to figure out how to make the patchwork panels alternate on both the inside and the outside leg, and also at the waistline at the front and back. Since there's like a cutout shape for the crotch, we've got all sorts of different shapes going on here. And I also wanted to seam directly on the side for the pocket. So I molded this over night after night, and eventually I was just like, oh my God, just sew the panels, sew it, and figure it out on the cutting board. So I started with a very big turquoise strip and a little navy strip. I sewed them together and then I snipped and ripped this giant panel into a bunch of even smaller panels. So when you're doing it this way, you have to stop ripping like just before you get to the seam, cut through the seam and a little pass with the scissors, and then keep ripping. You can't just rip through the seam, by the way. So love those. Want to make another pair. Somebody bought them. And lastly, my favorite, also somebody bought this, already sold, kind of sad about it, but I also have like 5 indigo jackets. Like I have enough indigo jackets in my wardrobe. But this is the Ashes jacket. So this started as a tapestry I was planning on stretching onto a wool panel, but it just felt so powerful and it felt like it needed to be on a jacket. I kept draping it over the backs of my shoulders, and finally I just gave into what the embroidery wants to be. So when your artwork speaks, listen to it. This embroidery was done probably years ago at this point, and I just never really got around to mounting it on wood, and I am so glad that I didn't. So the meaning behind it, I feel like might best be described by a rehashing of a popular Twitter post that said, quote, "Humans really could have had a beautiful little existence on Earth, just creating art and eating fruit. Instead, we have credit score and taxes." And listen, I actually don't have a problem with taxes, especially when they're used as a collective community support. I am very into that, but you get the point. So we've got the fire on the columns that have gone out. The smoke is all that's left of this polished and proper societal structure. We've returned back to the point where the mountains, not the buildings, are our gods. And the jacket's name was inspired by the nursery rhyme. And that, what is it? Ring Around the Rosie. Yeah, and at the end it goes, ashes, ashes, we all fall down, which I just love. But it's also a little bit of like a double meaning because it's calling on the phrase ashes to ashes, dust to dust, because in the end, nothing is permanent. So beyond the epic embroidery, this jacket was also kind of an engineering feat in the sense that the indigo fabrics that I had that I felt were similar in weight and color to this embroidery, I didn't have that much of the fabrics. I had 3 different fabrics, I think, that I used on this, maybe like a half to a quarter of a yard each. or I guess a quarter to a half a yard. But so decisions were made entirely around these constraints. So these constraints of the fabric shape basically dictated the dimensions of everything from the sleeve length to the width of the shawl collar to the height of the yoke in the back on top of the embroidery. And I am so happy I let the fabric lead the way. I mean, I even had to the sleeves didn't have enough for the hem, so I had to add an inch strip of another fabric on the inside to hem the sleeves so I could keep them at the length that I wanted them. Kind of stressful, mostly really fun though. All right, that's the whole collection. I've already started on the next one. I am, as usual, super excited about it. I can't wait to share more with you. There will be a whole lot of hand embroidery in the next collection because I found an amazing local hand stitcher who has been helping me bring all my visions into reality, which is amazing. I will be back in a couple weeks, probably with another video. Maybe, I'm not gonna hold myself to it, but maybe we wanna see it. I wanna share the process of making my first book, Mystical Stitches, because it's almost its 4th birthday. I love that book so much. It was such a rewarding process to see it come to life. And I feel like it happened a little bit differently than most books because it was stitched. So it was a little bit backwards in the design process. So I want to share all that. So please let me know if you'd like to see that. I would love some encouragement, really. All right, so you can check out the whole collection of Fallen Empires at the link below. You can get yourself into the Rectangle Tea mini course at the other link below. You can sign up for soft work at the 3rd link below. There's probably a bunch of other links below. Anyways, thank you for tuning in. Okay, bye. Head to mixedcolor.net for more. Oh, and I think this is the point where I'm supposed to ask you to like and subscribe, I guess.